It's such an honor to be with you, sir, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. You are the chairman of the Institute for Political Economy here in the United States. You are a former Wall Street editor and an author of many, many books. In Europe, we love you because you have a perspective that many do not have as you speak in broad manners about the important issues of foreign policy and the state of the American culture today. Many of the leading Western philosophers over the years have spoken about the need for fearless speech and the need for critical thinking and the need for investigative journalism and the need for independency from power structures. It's wonderful to have people like Chomsky and also yourself, Dr. Roberts, who are one of the few freethinkers and one of the few true independent intellectuals left that are able to speak openly and that do choose to speak openly about these issues that are so dire to our culture.
You see, the reason Chomsky and I can speak freely is that we don't want anything. We're not dependent on the establishment. If we were, we'd be shut down. So you have a situation in the West where there's hardly anybody who can afford to speak freely. If in any way you're dependent on them or you want anything from them, you can't. You know, all of the elements that were countervailing power to the establishment. You know, to have a society, it has to be countervailing powers. This power has to balance that one, or otherwise some group runs away with it all. Well, in the United States, all of these countervailing powers are being destroyed. For example, what was one of the main results of offshoring the middle class jobs, the manufacturing jobs, was to destroy the unions. So there's no longer any constraint by the unionized workforce on employers. So we're back to robbery-capitalism because the unions essentially are gone. What few exist are in the public sector, and they're now beginning to starve them out. No raises, cuts. They use austerity reasons. So, and as we've already said, there's no longer a media to constrain them. The care to the people in many ways has deteriorated, so people are no longer constrained by tradition, by morality, by a sense of integrity. All of these things which were constraints. There was always a limit beyond which most people wouldn't go. Where is that limit now? It's gone. So this is another problem for the West, that, in other words, it's very hard to fix when the termites have eaten everything in the house. It's going to come down. And this happened in a fairly short time. It wasn't a long, drawn-out thing. If you think back to after World War II, we had a country. It was a real country. We were unified. People believed in progress. There was goodwill. Where are these things?
There seems to have been such a landslide of morality, really, but in the whole West.
It's
The
collapsed.
past, yes, and we see America now as being a country over 50% of divorce. There's a culture of loneliness, really. So many issues pertaining to drug abuse and the family deteriorating, and then the effect of that on the single mother, the effect of that on the working class person, economy, and I would say really disregard for the poor. It's a surprising thing, because we all know if a democracy is supposed to work, and if the American system will continue to bloom, you cannot disregard everybody except the elite.
Right.
So that's the worrying tendency we see in America today.
Yes, it's the pendulum has swung back to robber capitalism. And the only mark of success is money. And how you got it doesn't matter. But if you've got the money. And the people, see, I can remember when a billionaire was unknown. And now everyone on the Forbes 400 list is a billionaire or multi-billionaire. And we talk about individuals, people who have $100 billion. That was the size of the entirety of the federal government when John F. Kennedy was president. So now one person, it's $100 billion. Who is that? The Google guy or the Amazon guy, Bezos. These are nonsensical sums for an individual. And when you have a system that produces that results, and yet the real median family income in the United States has not grown in 20 or 30 years. And the quality of the jobs keeps shrinking. They're increasingly domestic services, waitresses, bartenders, retail clerks, hospital orderlies. The jobs are increasingly part-time, because if they're part-time, the companies don't have to provide any benefits, or the jobs are contracted. For example, I think the power companies, they no longer, or some of them, many of them, no longer have their own work crews. They hire outside contractors because they don't have to pay payroll tax. And of course, the outside contractors don't have the same commitment to the company. And so there are more and more mistakes, more and more consequences. So the whole thing comes unglued in the pursuit of dollars. When I was in university, they taught us that a company had obligations to its workforce, its customers, its community, and its shareholders. And so the executives had to balance all of these obligations. But today, they're taught they only have obligation to the shareholder. They have to maximize the return to the shareholder. So they can ignore all obligations to employees, to customers, to communities. Well, this is the justification for offshoring, because when they offshore the jobs, they've thrown their workforce out. They have abandoned, they have destroyed the tax base for the communities. You see what I'm saying? The customers, they don't know what they're getting anymore. In the United States, you no longer can rely on clothing size. If you say you've got a 33-inch waist, and it says 33 inches, it might be 30, it might be 36. You can't buy anything that you don't try on, because it's all made somewhere else. And I think what happens, they make stuff and an order comes in, and whatever size the order asks for, they stick on whatever they already got made and send it. I've been in, even in Ralph Lauren, just looking at jeans. And so there are 3 styles. And the waist size will vary 2 or 3 inches from what it says on the label. So the customers also lose. So everyone loses but the shareholders. Because if they put the jobs offshore, the labor costs drop, the profits go up, the capital gains for the shareholders rise. And this is how they have created this massive income inequality and wealth inequality. You know, the Federal Reserve published, it's been a year or two, that for the majority of the American population, they could not raise $400 without selling personal assets. Now, this is America. The majority of the population cannot raise $400 cash without selling personal property, personal assets, their TV, their car, their ring, whatever. And yet, we have people worth $100 billion.
It's a paradox that I believe around 60 persons, individuals in the world now own over 50% of world assets. And it's another paradox that it was globalism that brought us into this situation, because what we've been hearing from the internationalists and the globalists for so many years and the liberal progressives for so many years was that the more we'd get globalism, the more we'd have wealth for everybody. So this has been a development, so much an undesired development, and a development towards totalitarianism. Would you agree to that?
Yes, I criticized globalism years ago and offshoring of jobs years ago, and I was accused of being against free trade. But it has nothing to do with free trade. Free trade is based on comparative advantage, which requires that a country's capital stays at home and finds its best use. And by specializing in what that country can do best, it then sells that and uses the proceeds to buy what other countries can make best. But what we've been doing is not based on comparative advantage, it's based on absolute advantage. That is, you are looking for the lowest possible factor cost, the lowest cost of production, the lowest cost of labor, the lowest cost of regulation. And so what this does is it sends you to where labor's cheapest, where there's no regulation, because then your profits are maximized. And those profits, of course, only go to management and owners. But the cost of getting those profits is you've destroyed the middle class, because all the jobs are offshore. And this doesn't just happen to manufacturing workers. In the United States, it now happens to university graduates, because they move offshore software engineering, information technology. Now many forms of research and design are offshore. Many aspects of accounting are offshore. Legal research. So the kinds of jobs people go to the university for, and they get huge student loans, they're heavily indebted, and they come out and there's no jobs. And so we've had reports again from the Federal Reserve that 50% of Americans 24 years old live at home with their parents. 50%. We have reports that there are more Americans aged 24 to 34 years of age, living at home with parents than are living independently. So the job situation is so poor that the young cannot form households. They can't marry, they can't buy a house, they can't even get an apartment. If you've got more people, 24 to 34, living at home with their parents or grandparents than living independently, well, you've got a collapsing society. That's what's happened. So why is the society collapsing? Because the jobs that sustained a rising income, a rising middle class, they're in China, Indonesia, India. That's not the function of the United States to destroy the prospects of its citizens in order to give prospects in Asia. In that sense, Trump's right. The country has deserted its own. And of course, it's largely the reason for the rise of China. So by doing this, we've created another power that is a constraint on American unilateralism, which is China, which is beginning to tell us what we can and cannot do in Asia. And we created that because if you move the jobs offshore, you have to move the technology with them. So they know how to do everything that we know how to do.
And it's a great question too in the retrospect of looking at the civilizations that have come and gone, and the Roman civilization and the Chinese.
Still there.
When we remember Sun Tzu, who spoke of in battle the need to hold the moral high ground. So that's another question as to why we seem to see the geopolitical shift towards the East today, and in the Middle East, as we see the contempt for America and the contempt for the failing wars in country after country, now lately in Syria, although we note that in American media, the Syria war is portrayed as a victory of the U.S., but you can just yet do so little, really, to change that. So these old Chinese wise men, such as Sun Tzu, really had a point.
Yes, and they're still there. China's still there. And now it's a very powerful place. I was there in 2006, and I was immensely amazed. Some of their cities make New York look like a country town. And the leadership, the people I spoke with, whew, very smart, very aware, could discuss anything. And having spent a quarter of a century in Washington, I trembled. I said, we don't have this kind of leadership. So, all the polls show that the two most despised countries is the United States and Israel. And it does look like that the United States and Israel are isolating themselves. Now, unfortunately, this also applies to Europe, because as my dissertation chairman told me, Europe reports to us. We own them. So the Western world is becoming isolated. And this is a very paradoxical result. That it's the West. Because we are trying to isolate China and Russia and Iran in North Korea, and I now see the North Koreans and South Koreans making friends. So what happens to that threat?
It's a paradox as a trend analyst. I also travel a lot in Asia and in the Middle East, and coming here to America this time, I came from Qatar, Doha. And it is a paradox because both in the Far East and as you stated with China, and as well in the Middle East, you find the most beautiful airports, sir. I mean, you think you're in Disneyland with golden columns and you know, floors, and I mean, it looks so wonderful. And then when you travel to the United States of America and you land here, whether it's Miami, Los Angeles, New York, wherever it is, Boston, it's like coming to a movie from the 1970s with dirty carpets and old-fashioned rugs. And I think many of the people that live in the West, they keep reading and hearing that we're the best, we're the best, we're the best. And they don't realize that as we're screaming we're the best in everything and that we're exceptional, the train really leaves the station, and the Easterners and others are taking over the hegemony in the world. Would you agree with me on that?
I think that increasingly the world sees that Putin is the leader. I think they see that. And in my opinion, he is. He's very thoughtful. He's very low-key. He doesn't respond to provocation with provocation. And I see also leadership in China. And I see in China a determination that the ruling class serve the people. It's not like the American ruling class, which serves itself at the expense of the people. That's not what the Chinese are doing. But they're portrayed as authoritarian and all of that sort of thing. But the way the party in China is organized, the way it's working, the harshest penalties fall on corruption inside the party. And the incentives are for the party to serve the people, and that's what's producing leadership. So, in a way, they're doing what our image used to be of the United States, where the government serves the people rather than itself or some interest groups that control it. And I think, too, in Russia, you can see the appreciation of the Russian people, of Putin, in his extremely high approval ratings. Nobody in the West has approval ratings like this. And in Russia, they have a freer press than we have. And not only that, they've got many newspapers that appear to be funded by the West for the purpose of criticizing Putin, and yet still the approval rating is very high. So it's a serious situation, and I think we will see in the 21st century that the West is eclipsed as the center of leadership, of civilization, of economic dominance. People won't look to the West to see what it is they should do. That I think is changing, and it's the fault of the West. And again, I think much of it comes back to the unleashing of the neoconservative ideology of American hegemony, which resulted from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because that removed the countervailing power that forced the United States to still think more broadly. It it was faced with a force it couldn't move aside. And so you couldn't unleash all of this self-interested greed that now characterizes the country, because it would doom you. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, then there's no longer a countervailing power. And so, oh, well, now we rule. And it's like that old saying goes, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the United States held absolute power between the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the rise of Putin. So that was a long time for power to corrupt. And it succeeded in corrupting. Of course, I'm sad about all this. It's funny in a way, but it's sad.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, for taking the time to speak to us, and we are so obliged, especially also since you are one of the few freely critical thinkers left in the West, and such a voice for precisely the type of investigative journalism that we need, and precisely that type of free thinker that the original Western societies so much encouraged. So thank you very much. We are so honored to have spoken to you.
Well, thank you very much for including me in your wonderful programs, because you too are a voice that's important.